Sam Rayburn said, "Any jackass can kick down a barn, but it takes a good carpenter to build one. And we in Congress are in the business of carpentry." Mr. Rayburn served as Speaker of the United States House of Representatives for the longest tenure in history, 17 years. When he relinquished his position as Speaker, he lost the use of his 1947 Cadillac, which served as his Speaker's limousine. The members of Congress were heartbroken to see their former leader without a car, so they made a plan to collect donations in order to purchase him a new Cadillac. Upon catching wind of the plan, Rayburn informed the congressman in charge that he had a personal stance against accepting gifts in excess of $25. With this in mind, the congressman collected $25 from many different members of Congress and purchased the former speaker a brand new Cadillac. This heartwarming story of admiration speaks to the influence that Sam Rayburn had in Washington, D.C. As second Speaker of the House from Texas, he worked endlessly to make Texas a player in national politics. His efforts paid off, both in Texas's influence in the nation's capital, as well as in the form of a Cadillac that still sits in the garage of his historic home today. To fully understand the rich history that lies within the walls of the home and the mechanics of the Cadillac, we must first examine the history of the house itself. Next, we must look at how the house and the man who inhabited it put Texas on the political map. Finally, to fully understand the impact that Sam Rayburn had on our phenomenal state, we must examine how his legacy lives on today. In 1914, Sam Rayburn and his brother paid $6,000 and purchased 121 acres of land in the quaint, little, mostly forgotten town of Bonham, Texas. He once said, "The one thing besides people that I claim to know is land." He proved this by building a farm that produced cotton, corn, and sorghum crops, and provided pasture land for cattle over the next 2 years. On his land, he built a charming two-story home from a Sears and Roebuck kit, which he continued to add on to for many years. Today, the house still contains all of the original furnishings placed there by Speaker Rayburn. They are all in the same place as when Rayburn would pace his home, thinking of ways to make Texas politics a force to be reckoned with. Because the Speaker was only married for a brief time, he never had any children. However, he was never alone in his home. He opened his home to his family to live with him and grow with him as he moved through the ranks from congressman to speaker. Beyond sharing his home with his family, he opened it to the people of Bonham, who were almost indistinguishable from his family. The Sam Rayburn House acts as a metaphor for what Texas truly represents as a state. The house was a place where everyone was welcome and all thoughts and ideas were heard. Now that we have an idea of how Speaker Rayburn created his humble dwelling, let's explore how the house and the man gave way to put Texas politics on the map. Sam Rayburn was elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 1907. During his time as Speaker, he attended the University of Texas Law School and earned his law degree in 1908. While serving in the Texas House of Representatives, he was elected as Speaker of the House. Shortly after, in 1913, he was elected as the congressman from Texas and served under President Woodrow Wilson. He remained a congressman for 49 years. In 1940, Sam Rayburn was elected Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. He served off and on when the Democrats were in power, and off when the Republicans had taken control of the House. During his time as Speaker, he oversaw the spread of electricity through the United States and served as the chief congressional sponsor for the New Deal. Dr. James Riddlesberger, a political science professor from Texas Christian University, stated that Rayburn was a man who could say, "Trust me." And the answer among the representatives was, "Yes, Mr. Sam." He proved this with arguably his most successful move during his time as Speaker, getting multi-million-dollar appropriations approved by Congress without the representatives knowing for what it was intended. In truth, the money was allocated to the Manhattan Project, which had to be kept under wraps for the obvious implications of alerting the world to America's atomic bomb creation process. Sam Rayburn ushered in the age of the New Deal and nuclear power. He saw America becoming a leading world power and the beginning of the civil rights era. According to the Sam Rayburn House website, Rayburn had said, "When I get away from Washington, there isn't anywhere in the world I want to go but home." And that's what he considered Bonham, home. Now, when I was in high school, there came a time in my relationship with my best friend where I didn't knock, I didn't ring the doorbell, and to be completely honest, I didn't even call before I came over. I had their garage door passcode, and I would just sort of let myself in. I'm a true believer in the saying, acquaintances coming through the front door and friends coming through the back door, or in my case, the garage door. Speaker Rayburn shared in my belief of this philosophy. When he wasn't working in Washington, D.C., he was home in his office welcoming the people of Bonham through his back door. He always took the time to listen to what his constituents had to say to ensure that he was providing for the people. Practices like this fueled Rayburn's efforts to put Texas politics on the map. Upon becoming Speaker of the House, Speaker Rayburn earned the unique opportunity to appoint representatives to congressional committees. Rayburn put a Texan on every major committee in Congress to ensure that Texans had fingers in every piece of the pie, so to say. Beyond this, each week Speaker Rayburn held meetings with the delegates from Texas. Even weeks were social meetings in which everyone was invited. On odd weeks, the meetings were closed so that the Texas delegates could discuss their movements to become more influential in Washington, D.C. These kinds of acts showed that Sam Rayburn was a true Texan. He was a respected and effective leader who was rarely challenged and regularly successful. Speaker Rayburn's legacy in Texas and national politics shows that the true nature of Texas can shine through even in the rough and cruel world of Washington, D.C. politics. Like many Texans, he was a plain talker and a straight shooter. He knew there was no point in beating around the bush on any occasion. He was quoted saying, "I have found that people respect you if you tell them where you stand." Sam Rayburn was known for his fairness and integrity. He made sure to treat each member of Congress with respect, no matter their political affiliation or views on particular topics of discussion. It is still said among members of Congress and those who knew him that Sam Rayburn's credibility was legendary. According to Dr. Riddlesberger, the Speaker of the House was universally respected as a man of integrity. Rayburn also played the important role of mentor in more than one notable politician's life. Among his proteges were names such as Jim Wright, who also went on to become Speaker of the House, and Lyndon B. Johnson, who became president in 1963. D.B. Herdman and Donald Bacon stated in their book, Rayburn, that the Speaker had many friends throughout Congress. One of his best friends was Harry Truman. According to the book, Raymond was having a drink with Truman when he received the call that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died, making Truman the 33rd President of the United States upon his repetition of the oath of office. However, beyond all of his legislation, powerful influence, and kind-heartedness, he was best known for the way he dressed. He dressed perfectly for every occasion. When legislating in Washington, D.C., he could be seen wearing expensive suits and shine shoes. However, when he re-entered his district of representation, he was seen wearing button-downs, Wranglers, and cowboy boots. He clearly knew how to connect with his constituency. When I spoke with Dr. Riddlesberger about Speaker Rayburn, and we talked about the respect that all had for him, Dr. Riddlesberger smiled and began to laugh. "Don't get me wrong," he said. "He could be mean as hell if you crossed him." Even with his apparent temper, his greatest wish was for others to think well of him. He took care of his own, and he took care of his state. He embodied the true values of Texas in his caring nature and deep integrity. Arguably one of my favorite quotes by the late Speaker is, "The greatest ambition a man can have is to be a just man." To me, this speaks volumes of the kind of person that he was. He cared for others, but beyond anything, he cared for his fellow Texans. He worked endlessly to ensure that the country knew that Texas was a political force that had to be recognized on the national stage. Through examining the rich history of the Sam Rayburn House, the political influence provided, and the legacy left behind, we have a much better understanding of how the Sam Rayburn House continues to act as a metaphor for what Texas truly represents as a state. A place where everyone is welcome and all thoughts and ideas are heard. Speaker Rayburn was a great man, but above all, He was a great Texan.
Ashley, thank you very much for sharing with us. Now I'd like to ask our guest to come up who was from that little burg called Bonham. Grew up in Bonham, Texas. Our good fortune that after going to Washington and working for Sam Rayburn, made his way to Fort Worth and has become one of the leading citizens in our community. This person I'm about to introduce was a distinguished alumnus of this university, a distinguished alumnus of George Washington University Law School, which he had the opportunity to attend because of his relationship with Sam Rayburn. Founding partner of Kelly Hart and Hallman, and really one of the great leaders who've helped build our community into what it is today. And he will tell you in a moment that so much of what he is today came because of the relationship and the mentorship that he had from Sam Rayburn. D. Kelly, please join me. Mr. Kelly.
Jim, is you going to read the letter?
No, we're going to do that. We're going to do that after. Okay, all right. We're going to do this. All right. Mr. Kelly, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to hear about the experience you had growing up with Sam Rayburn. But you also had the opportunity to work very closely with another Speaker of the House, another Texan. And could you please share your thoughts about Jim Wright?
Well, Jim, I shouldn't tell you what Mr. Rayburn thought about you because you know. Mr. Rayburn loved Jim Wright. He thought he was, he loved him as a man and also as a member of Congress. Jim, I remember when you first ran for Congress, 1954. Ran against the incumbent Wingate Lucas, supported by Amon Carter Sr. and the Star-Telegram, heavily. Mr. Rayburn knew instinctively that Jim Wright would do a lot better job at Fort Worth than his opponent. And he was so pleased when we got elected. And it's been an honor to all these years, Jim, to have you as a friend and colleague and mentor myself. You know, I don't think neither the city of Fort Worth or neither Sam Rayburn or the city of Fort Worth ever had a better friend, Jim Wright. Jim, we're so happy to be here and we're honored to be here because you're here.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. You met Sam Rayburn when you were a young man, when you were still in high school. Could you talk about how you met him and what was he like as a person?
I met Sam Rayburn when I was a junior in high school. I wrote a column for the Bonham High School newspaper. I got an interview to interview Mr. Rayburn. I went to see him in his home in Bonham, a few miles from Bonham. Well, actually about 5 miles from Bonham. And I asked him, do you have any advice for young people? And he said this. He said, I recall distinctly what his advice. He said, I remember the most exceptional members of Congress were always the ones who worked the hardest. That's that's advice I'd give to young people. If you work hard, you succeed. Like all my colleagues did work hard. So that's what he said to me. Mm-hmm. Now I campaigned, Mr. Rayburn, in rural areas of Fort Worth. I mean, rural areas of 4th District, not Fort Worth. And we used to campaign on the back of a pickup truck. I'd drive the truck, Mr. Rayburn campaign the back of it. He'd address the crowd. One of the first things I noticed about it, I've already mentioned already tonight, that he had a remarkable memory. He could remember 3 generations back, grandfather, and everybody. It's unbelievable. I remember one occasion Carl Albert came to hear one of his speeches, and Carl Albert was from Muskogee, Oklahoma, running for Congress. I remember Mr. Rayburn saying on the way home that night, he said, this Carl Albert's going to do well in the Congress, you wait and see. He said he was right again because he was Speaker of the House later himself. A lot of Mr. Rayburn's old colleagues and mentors got to be Speaker of the House. He didn't notice it.
Could you reflect back a little on what he talked about as a candidate? He was a child of the Depression, grew up in the toughest times we ever experienced as a state. Could you talk about how that shaped his attitude, how it shaped his politics?
Well, Mr. Rayburn's very humble and who never lost his roots. I rode from Denison, Texas to Washington, D.C. many times from him. Never rode an airplane, he slept better than I did, I know that. I recall one Saturday afternoon and when George C. Marshall came to Mr. Rayburn's office. General Marshall was the head of the Chief of Staff during World War II and monitored one of the greatest military operations in the history of the country. When he came to see Mr. Rayburn, he was Secretary of State. I remember distinctly, he was about to come to Mr. Rayburn's office that afternoon, and just before he met the speaker, Mr. Rayburn got word from a couple of extra Texans was there in the hot sun in July, waiting to see him outside, but they're too embarrassed to come up to see him because they wasn't dressed properly. So the speaker stepped out the back door of his room, went downstairs, spoke to those people before he came back, and attended to General Marshall. That was just typical of Mr. Rayburn. He never lost contact with his people, his roots, or his constituents.
He thought the Secretary of State could wait while he greeted his friends from Exeter.
He did.
Mr. Kelly, you worked for Mr. Rayburn in Washington. How'd you get that job? It was a different era then. What were your responsibilities? What was the size of the staff? What did you do on a day?
Well, I graduated TCU in 1950. I was able to get a clerk's job at Mr. Rayburn. I attended law school at George Washington. Worked in the Speaker's office on the congressional office on the south side of the Capitol. I worked in the Speaker's office routine. I would type letters for the constituents and around here as the Speaker. Speaker's staff was small. We had 7 people in the Speaker's office those days. 7 people. There's probably 700 people working with the Speaker today. Mr. Rayburn had a habit of going to, after Congress adjourned, he'd go to the parliamentary office, which is the Speaker's main office in the Capitol. It's on the north side of the Capitol. After doing that, normally, he'd generally go back to his congressional office and back to get his messages. I remember one occasion, and I went to law school about 6 o'clock, so I would wait. Hopefully, I'd catch him one day when he came back to the congressional office. One day I did. He raised my salary the next day.
Can you talk about the Board of Education and the role it played and how Rayburn ran the House and what went on there? And you had a personal experience with the Board of Education as well.
Mr. Rayburn had a first floor on the Capitol called the Board of Education. He hated the name, Board of Education. He hated it. Didn't like that name at all. The Board of Education was a room when Mr. Rayburn retired at the end, and he was a bachelor, remember. Retired at the end of the day, and he'd invite some of his friends by for a drink. And one of the greatest compliments a man could have in the House or the Senate was to be invited to that Board of Education room, right, Jim? Now, I got a key to that Board of Education one time. I don't know how I got it, but I got it. And the House used to adjourn in August of the year. So I'd go down and study when Mr. Rayburn's in Bonham. And quite an interesting place, the House. They had various kinds of refreshment in that room. And I remember one, it was mostly pinch bottle scotch. Mr. Rayburn finally found out I had a key to that room and took it away from him right quick. That's the last I had to do. That's what I had to do with the Board of Education.
His good friend Harry Truman used to be a guest often in the Board of Education. Could you reflect back on that and Harry Truman's visits there and some of the historic occasions that happened there?
Vice President Truman was in the Board of Education when Stephen Early called Mr. Rayburn and told him Franklin D. Roosevelt had died. And he was excused and went direct to the White House to meet Mrs. Roosevelt. President Truman and Sam Rayburn are great friends. The only picture, if you've ever been to Independence, Missouri, you see the Rayburn Truman Library, you'll see there are 2 pictures on his desk. One is Bess, other is Sam Rayburn. I was watching television when Truman made his first address to the joint session after Roosevelt died. He was nervous. He started speaking before the speaker didn't present him. I remember you hear it plainly on television. He said, Harry, please wait, let me present you. He was so nervous he started talking before Rayburn got a chance to present him.
Well, when President Truman left office, they remained friends, and you've shared with me before that President Truman had decided not to take many of the financial opportunities that many presidents have, and he worked with Sam Rayburn to help him in his retirement.
Well, when President Truman retired, he refused to make speeches and take fees. He wouldn't take fees like they take today. He wouldn't go on boards. So he was broke when he left the White House, basically. He used to write Mr. Rayburn letters about getting a presidential pension. The man needed he needed some money to live on. Mr. Rayburn finally got the first presidential pension of $25,000 a year. But Harry Truman would not go on boards, would not take fees for speaking because he's ex-president. He did it because he thought it was not the right thing to do. So Mr. Rayburn got his speech, gave the first presidential pension $25,000 a year.
The presidential campaign in 1948 was one of the great upsets in history, and President Truman was not popular in Texas, was not popular in Sam Rayburn's congressional district. But Sam Rayburn welcomed Truman to Bonham in 1948, and I believe you were there.
I was there. Mr. Rayburn had a train. He campaigned throughout 48 with a train. He got that train to Bonham, Texas. I don't know how he got it, but he got the train to Bonham, Texas. Mr. Rayburn gave a reception at his house in Bonham. I remember going there, and the first time I'd ever seen the President of the United States in my life. I know the President had a silver hair, and then it's tan, and his big glasses. And it was amazing to see a man in Bonham, Texas. I don't know how many votes he got in Fannin County, but he sure didn't have the President, but he was there. He was there because Mr. Rayburn, he loved Sam Rayburn.
Today our Congress is very partisan. You can't turn on the television without being reminded of that. Mr. Rayburn's era was a different time. He had a warm friendship with Joe Martin, who he traded the speakership with. Can you talk about that, his friendship with Joe Martin and the relationship across the aisle in those days?
Joe Martin was from Massachusetts, was leader of the Republican House and Senate. In the House. Became Speaker in 1946. First time in 50 years Democrats lost control of the House of Representatives. Joe Martin and Sam Rayburn were great friends. They were poles apart politically. But Rayburn never heard a harsh word against Joe Martin. In fact, when Democrats regained the House in 1948, Mr. Rayburn let Joe Martin keep the majority where I used to work. He used to keep that office, and Mr. Rayburn stayed in the minority leader's office. He didn't want to inconvenience Joe Martin, but FDR called Rayburn about the development of the atomic bomb, and that was great, utmost secret, because Germany was trying to develop the bomb as well. He was able to procure, with the help of Joe Martin, I'm sure, the necessary funds to get that bomb, that weapon funded. And it's in August '41, months before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Mr. Rayburn stepped out of the chair to vote for the draft. The draft passed in '41, 4 months for the outbreak of World War II, by one vote. So I think two of the greatest accomplishments he ever made in his life was he funded that weapon, and he saved the draft at a time when we were woefully unprepared for war.
Ms. Kelly, earlier today we saw a picture of Sam Rayburn's limousine that's parked in a garage in Bonham. You have a personal connection to that limousine. I wish you'd tell that story.
Well, you heard this. I should tell you that after 1948, after the Democrats regained control of the House, and they felt so great they gave Mr. Rayburn this black Cadillac car. Mr. Rayburn made the mistake of asking me to drive it to Bonham. He said, "We'd be very careful driving that car to Bonham. Be careful that car's not damaged. You be careful about yourself."
I told you to drive slow, I think.
And I went directly to Bonham. I never stopped to hardly go to the bathroom and go to I drove that car straight through from Washington to Bonham. Got there in about 24 hours. I had the good sense, though, not to tell Miss Rayburn about it for 3 days after I got home. By the way, that's the last I ever heard of that black Cadillac. I've never seen it in Bonham since.
LBJ referred to Sam Rayburn as a father figure to him, and often talked about his love for Rayburn, that one of the most influential relationships in his life. Can you talk about the relationship that you saw up close when you worked for Sam Rayburn in Washington?
Mr. Rayburn and Senator Johnson were close personal and political friends. I got acquainted with most of Senator Johnson's staff in those days. Senator Johnson would come to see Mr. Rayburn frequently. Occasionally, when he came, President Truman called him. and Senator Johnson always excused himself when that happened. Senator Johnson became majority leader. Then Mr. Rayburn and Senator Johnson could control both houses of Congress, Senate and the House. They had to drink frequently together. They discussed the schedule for the next day. So that they didn't have much divergence of opinion between the House and Senate then, because they collaborated and knew what's going to happen the next day on both their schedules. So it's unusual. Mm-hmm. Not like today by any means.
It was an extraordinary era when you think about the influence that Texas and Texans had on the Congress. Working up there, you had an opportunity to meet and work with a lot of members of Congress who really became household names in American political history. Can you talk about some of those members you worked with?
I met a number of prominent people when I worked for Mr. Rayburn. Couldn't keep from it. They kept coming to his office all the time. Texas delegation in the House was very strong. You had, in addition, you had Senator Johnson, Congressman Benson, and Jim Wright, who were among Mr. Rayburn's closest friends and mentors. He was a mentor to them, I should say. In the case of Congressman Benson, Mr. Rayburn was particularly fond of his wife, B.A. Benson. She was a Conover model. I remember that. Mr. Rayburn liked her a lot. Some of the distinguishing Texans visited Mr. Rayburn were C.W. Richardson and Perry Bass and John Connolly of Fort Worth. I remember that very distinctly. Mr. Richardson, of course, was a famous Texas wildcatter, and nephew of Perry Bass, became a legendary figure himself. John Connolly acted as counsel for them in those days. He later became governor of Texas, Secretary of the Navy under President Kennedy, Secretary of the Treasury under President Nixon.
Can you share other memories? What an extraordinary time in American history you were working for Rayburn in Washington. Can you talk about some of the other experiences you had?
It was an exciting time when General MacArthur, Truman fired him after the Korean War. He was invited to speak to a joint session of Congress. Another of Mr. Rayburn's aides and I, we went to the speaker's rooms where he'd be. We saw him come down Pennsylvania Avenue at the Capitol, and he'd gather in the speaker's office before people came and pick him up. We went directly to that office to see him to greet him when he came in the office. He came in the office, took that historic hat, placed it on the receptacle. We said, "Good morning, General." He didn't say anything to either one of us. Went straight to the mirror behind the speaker. Had a big long time mirror. He had a little hair. A little more than Pete has today.
What are you looking at?
But at any rate, I slipped after the members of Congress came to pick him up and stayed in the joint session of Congress. I slipped behind the rostrum of the Speaker's office to watch him speak. And that was a famous speech. He said, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." I've never seen the House so silent during that speech, not a word. He got a standing ovation. And then Jim McDade and I, my friend, we slipped back in the Speaker's office to agree when he got through the speech. Came back in, "Great speech, General." Did nothing to either one of us, noticed both, went back to that mirror again, placed his hat, got his hat, and left. I recall another occasion when I went to, Mr. Rayburn and I went to Greenville, Texas, where he was scheduled to address a political rally. He kept a Chevrolet at his home in Bonham. Why, I don't know. I never saw that Chevrolet used. For some reason, he decided he was going to drive himself to Greenville that night. At that time, Mr. Rayburn had been Speaker for 10 years and had been chauffeured everywhere in Washington. Never drove himself anywhere that I knew about. But at any rate, he wanted to drive that night. I recall when we got to Greenville, we didn't know where we were. He went down, first went one-way street, the wrong way. I said, "Mr. Speaker, I think we're on the wrong way street." "By God, I think you're right." He turned right, went across the main thoroughfare at Greenville, and had a truck almost hit us going across that thoroughfare. I said, "Mr. Speaker, I think we're going to get hit." He said, "By God, let's get out of here." So we got across the street just in time. We could have lost the great state right there with that car. By the way, I drove back to Bonham that night. I was single the days I worked for Washington. I was a young man then, really. And I remember on one case, Mrs. Lyndon Johnson asked me and Warren Woodward, who worked for Senator Johnson, to take out two of their lady friends. Miss Johnson had a niece, and Woody had she had some guests from San Antonio. We thought that's a good idea. So Mr. Rayburn thought that's a good idea, so he thought that George Dunn would drive us in his limousine. And then he found out we were going to dinner, so he said, "I want to help you boys." So he gave us a $20 bill to pay for dinner that night. Now, Mr. Rayburn's a very frugal man, but $20 didn't go very far for 4 people in those days. Later that same evening, when we were in the theater that night, we saw a lot of famous people come by, including Secretary of State and Dean Acheson and his wife. They were seated just 2 rows in front of us. After the show was over, we went back to the theater and stood around watching all the important people come by. After a while, we noticed Secretary of State had not left his limousine. Finally, George Donovan, who was radio speaker, came and running to us. "Get in the car, boys. The Secretary of State can't leave. The speaker's limousine leaves." So we finally let Secretary of State get home. He got home late. Got late getting home that evening.
The 1960 Democratic Convention, the role that the Texans played in that convention is truly historic. You were with Rayburn at that convention. You were there as a volunteer working for him. I understand that Mr. Rayburn and then former President Truman worked together to try to help President Johnson get the nomination over Kennedy. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I remember attending the Democratic National Convention in 1960 at Los Angeles as an aide to Mr. Rayburn. President Truman, Mr. Rayburn, and John Connally were all supporting Senator Johnson heavily for the president. He was the underdog, of course, to Senator Kennedy. Sid Richardson died in 1959. At the time, Mr. Connally was working with Perry R. Bass and was an independent executive of Mr. Richardson's will. For a time, he served on the Richardson Foundation, where Pete is director today. President Truman was not in attendance, but he and Mr. Rayburn and John Connally talked every day, plotting and planning to try to get Lyndon Johnson the nomination of the president. They finally conceived the idea that they challenge President Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, to debate between the Massachusetts and the Texas delegation. They thought that President Kennedy wouldn't accept it because he was way ahead in the delegates. Well, he refused them. He fooled them. He did accept. And that was the most interesting debate I'd ever heard in my life. Lyndon Johnson was criticizing Senator Kennedy for not being available to him when he needed the Senate. He had to serve the Senate by himself. He didn't help the Senate without campaigning for president. President Kennedy responded to us, "Well, I don't need to worry about the Senate because you take care of it, Mr. President, Mr. Senator. You're a wonderful, wonderful majority leader. We love you greatly." But at any rate, I like to miss getting into that debate because Jake Pickle was a doorkeeper. Remember, he wouldn't let me. I got in though anyway. But they both performed extremely well, and I think they in good humor. And I don't think it had much effect on the election, but I thought Lyndon Johnson did as good a job I've ever seen him do in my life. And I thought and President Kennedy did as well. There's considered speculation after that. If Vice President Johnson, the President would take Senator Johnson would take the vice presidency. Mr. Rayburn, I had lunch one day with Edward R. Murrah, and I was invited by Mr. Rayburn to had lunch with Edward R. Murrah, famous CBS correspondent, TV personality, and he asked Mr. Rayburn, "Do you think Lyndon Johnson would take the vice presidency?" The speaker said, "No, I don't think he should. I hope he doesn't." And he had no uncertain terms about that. Yes, he's very fervent, very strongly opposed to him to take that vice presidency. Well, I thought the nomination was over, so I decided to go back to Bonham. So as soon as before I got there, it was announced that Senator Johnson would be the vice president for under President Kennedy. I called Mr. Rayburn and asked him what happened. He said, "Well, Lyndon did all he could do, did what he had to do. He's always, he's always a team man, wasn't he, Jim?" So he went along with it. Later, President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy charmed Mr. Rayburn because he was opposed to both of them. They succeeded in charming. I recall seeing a picture of Mr. Rayburn fishing and a note attached to it from Miss Kennedy saying, "We know who the big fish is, don't we?" And right beneath that note was a note from President Kennedy saying, "Yes, we do." One of President Kennedy's great strengths was his ability to self-depreciation. I think that was we witnessed that in the delegation the debate between the Texas and the Massachusetts delegation. He's very self-depreciating. One of his virtues, I think, was he always found room to criticize himself.
Now, after the election, I understand that the Speaker helped John Connally get a job in the Kennedy administration.
Mr. Richardson and Mr. Bass frequently invited Mr. Rayburn to San Jose Island, and John Connally would always be present. They'd shoot quail and turkeys on the island, and they were deer and other game there. When Mr. Rayburn got ready to leave the island, Mr. Bass always made sure that Mr. Rayburn got all the game they killed that weekend. He'd go back to Bonham and split it with his family. He had 11 brothers and sisters. Mr. Rayburn was not the best shot in the world, but on one occasion, John Connolly thought he'd made a shot, and he said, "Great shot, Mr. Speaker." The Speaker said, "John, I didn't fire my gun." There's no question Mr. Rayburn was fond of John Connolly. I recall being in Mr. Raybur's home in Bonham one afternoon when then President-elect Kennedy called him, asking him regarding people in his cabinet. Mr. Rayburn described John Connolly as one of the ablest men in the state. And John Connolly always believed, and he was correct, the major reason why President Kennedy later made him Secretary of the Navy.
Sam Rayburn died in 1961 while still serving as Speaker. There's the famous photograph showing Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Eisenhower, and Truman in attendance. You were there. Share your memories about his passing, when you learned of his death, and memories from the day of that funeral.
Sam Rayburn died on November 16, 1961 of cancer. I would go see the Speaker in those days. I'd go from Fort Worth to Bonham to see him and talk to him. He didn't know what was wrong with him. He wondered what was wrong with him. He had cancer, of course. He said thought he had lumbago. But I remember the funeral being attended by President Kennedy, Vice President Johnson, along with former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower. The minister who conducted that funeral was a man from Ector, Texas. And having this gentleman do the eulogy of Sam Rayburn was typical of his roots. He thought these country people were his friends, and he wanted him to do the eulogy. I think H.G. Delaney used to manage the Rayburn Library. He was from Ector, Texas. I suspect that H.G. had something to do with that man preaching Sam Rayburn's funeral. He did a good job, though. Attended the service at Willow Isle Cemetery after the funeral was over. And General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, lost his way, couldn't find his car. Can you imagine that? I guess they didn't have Secret Service days back in those days for former presidents. I showed him the car. I said, General car's right over there. So he finally found it. He had a military aide with him. He had no Secret Service person. Can you imagine the President of the United States trying to find his way to a funeral now these days?
Skelly, do you have an opinion about why a man with Sam Rayburn's personality, with his abilities, was able to stay Speaker for 17 years? And what are some of the great accomplishments that you recall from his service and when you were there as well?
Mr. Rayburn was a born leader. You can't be Speaker of the House 17 years without being a leader of both parties. You got to have friends on both sides of the aisle. Mr. Rayburn was a small-town, rural conservative in many ways, who always fought for social reform in the country. He could be both conservative and progressive. But what was important about the man was he had great sympathy and feelings for the needs and rights of people. President Roosevelt relied on Sam Rayburn to pass the Social Security Act, one of the greatest acts in the history of the country. He was all for that. As you heard earlier, he was chairman of the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee. Some of the great legislation in the history of the country passed while he was chairman of the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee. The farm to market roads, rural electrification, that's all rural stuff, see. Also, the Security Exchange Act. Can you imagine Sam Rayburn, little man from Bonham, being the author of the Security Exchange Act? That complicated? He did. He was. He was a great man in many ways. He was a great man in every way.
Well, for many years, you chaired and you continue to serve on the board of the Sam Rayburn Foundation, which runs the Sam Rayburn Library in Bonham. And under your leadership, that library has helped capture the life and times and the philosophy of Sam Rayburn for all time. There's a sculpture plaza in Bonham that you were a part of having constructed that has some speeches from Sam Rayburn's life and career. Can you talk about that museum and also talk about some of the things that you and the other foundation leaders chose to memorialize in memory of Sam Rayburn?
If you haven't been to Bonham, you ought to go. There's a life-size statue of Mr. Rayburn on the plaza in Bonham, west of Bonham. The plaza also contains words from Mr. Rayburn's speeches while he was in the House. My favorite quotes are these. When a voter asks me a question, I treat him the same way as I do with my colleagues who honored me so long in the national capital. I tell him the truth for the first time. Never have to remember it. My answer to them would always be the same. I've I've always dreamed of a country where lawmakers had only the purpose and to write just laws, and that shall in the years to come be of service to all citizens yet unborn. Jim, if the Speaker were alive today, he would say to you, Mr. Speaker, well done, Jim Wright. You made it a better place for all of us to live in Fort Worth and throughout the country. You served our country well. Nothing can be expected more of any man. Jim Wright, we love you, and we honor you today along with Sam Rayburn. Thank you.
Mr. Kelly, thank you very much for sharing your memories with us today. Now I'd like to ask Dr. Riddlesberger to come forward. Jim was the person who put this day together and invited our distinguished scholars from around the country and come and share their insights into Sam Rayburn's life. Jim, you did an outstanding job of doing this, and now Speaker Wright has asked Dr. Riddlesberger to please share some of his thoughts about Sam Rayburn with us. But before you do that, Jim, just let us all thank you for putting together this symposium and for your leadership on the Wright Symposium over the years.
I do want to pause for a minute and mention the two people who actually did all the work to put this symposium together, Tammy Harding and Darla Scroggins, the secretaries in our department. Thank you all so much. I can't imagine an assemblage in Fort Worth, Texas that could include two more distinguished people than Jim Wright and D.J. Kelly. I thought it was a wonderful thing to do the Jim Wright Symposium honoring the memory of Sam Rayburn. And when they asked, should this be in the Brown-Lupton University Union or in the D.J. Kelly Alumni Center, I said, there's no choice. The D.J. Kelly Alumni Center stands as one of the measures of the many, many, many things that D.J. Kelly has done for Fort Worth over the years. Mr. Kelly, thank you so much for being here. Imagine me with oratory skills and bushy eyebrows, and I'll do my best to deliver Speaker Wright's thoughts. Most House colleagues were saying, Mr. Speaker. Some still called him Mr. Sam, and nobody asked of whom it was that they spoke in that middle period of the 20th century. Samuel Taliaferro Rayburn was not only the longest-serving presiding officer in the history of the U.S. Congress. I believe he was also the most effective leader and the most unhesitatingly trusted. Mr. Rayburn's back scenes help and advice was sought by presidents of both parties and treasured by veteran lawmakers. Among the vignettes of remembrance that come rushing back at the mention of Mr. Rayburn's name is an event that occurred on January 6, 1955. It was on the occasion of President Dwight D. Eisenhower's third annual State of the Union message. The President unexpectedly began his speech by mentioning that it was January 6th and the 72nd birthday of the venerable Speaker of the House, and publicly wishing for Mr. Rayburn many happy returns of the day. Instantly, the crowd that fitted the House chamber was on its feet, noisily cheering, whistling, and stamping its feet, and clapping its hands in a reverberating approval of the Speaker. Visitors in the gallery could not distinguish Republican from Democrat. The noisy ovation persisted until Mr. Rayburn, faintly blushing, rose from his seat behind the dais and gently rapped his gavel to restore order. One of my primary duties after my first election to Congress was to stop by and pay my respects to the Speaker. It was there that I learned of how willing he was to share his wisdom. In the process of expressing my desire to be a team player, I mentioned I thought I'd thought of applying for assignment on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Hoping to enlist his aid in fulfilling my ambition, I mentioned my long-held ambition to make a lasting contribution to world peace. The old gentleman calmly replied, "That's a wonderful ambition, but I'd hate to see you disappointed. Have you considered how little influence the House Committee exerts on those matters?" Rayburn explained the powers held exclusively by the Senate, ratification of treaties and the making of ambassadors, and how the assertion of these powers often fairly monopolizes the field of congressional initiative and foreign policy. Then he contrasted the opportunities for almost immediate and visible service to the citizens of one's community and state through an active House committee known as Public Works. There was an available vacancy for a Texan on that committee, he said, and added he hoped that I might like to seize that opportunity and become an effective advocate for Texas and other areas needing approval for worthy projects. 22 years later, in 1977, I was in place by seniority to be the next chairman of Public Works until colleagues whom I'd assisted and befriended were urging me to seek the post of House Majority Leader. This post, second in influence to that of the Speaker, was just being vacated by Tip O'Neill, who was stepping up to be Speaker. I thought back over those 2 decades to that day in Rayburn's office and thanked my long-deceased benefactor for his good advice. Sam Rayburn's personal popularity crossed party lines, just as did his friendship and respect for members of both parties. Mr. Sam's personal admiration for his opposite number in the House leadership, Representative Joe Martin of Massachusetts, the elected minority leader, was well known. The Democratic Speaker would tolerate in his presence no criticism of Republican Martin. I've heard Rayburn say, "If Joe tells you something, you can absolutely put it in the bank." One telling incident occurred following 2 brief 2-year intervals in which the Republicans had enjoyed a temporary majority. During those short periods, Martin had moved his private office accoutrements into the space reserved for the Speaker and his staff. I don't know what's going on with this. Maybe it's me. Okay. After the second such 2-year switch, Rayburn learned how attached his opposite number had become to the view from the west window of his temporary quarters, encompassing the long, grassy mall, past the monuments to the Lincoln Memorial and the National Cemetery across the Potomac River. Learning of his rival's powerful, deep personal regret at having to abandon this cherished treasure for a second time, Rayburn approached Joe Martin personally and said, "Joe, I'm tired of this moving back and forth. Why don't you and I just stay where we are with our little private offices and devote our time to legislating instead of shuffling our books and papers around?" Needless to say, the Massachusetts Republican was personally thrilled in spite of his party's loss of its brief House majority. Rayburn, with all his strong sense of fairness to the opposing party, made no secret of his own convictions and affiliations. Without prefix, without suffix, and without apology, "I am a Democrat," he would say whenever asked. As much as he respected the presidency and gave honor to the presidents of both parties, he insistently upheld the constitutional equality between the 2 branches, and stubbornly refused ever to consider the Congress in any way subordinate to the presidency. Asked toward the end of his career how many presidents he'd served under, Rayburn crisply replied, I've never served under any. I've served with 8. But the solemn constitutional demands of the presidential office were never minimalized in Rayburn's view. Early on, he had developed a close personal friendship with Vice President Harry Truman, and the two men were enjoying a private visit over coffee in a small office in the Capitol just off the House chamber at the time President Roosevelt was pronounced dead in Georgia. The telephone rang, and the two men learned that the White House was calling for Vice President Truman. Rayburn watched as his friend acknowledged, listened, and then fell deadly silent, his face ashen and bearing a horrified expression. No words were necessary. Both men knew instinctively the president was dead, and Vice President Harry Truman was automatically occupying the office. Truman's first words were an exhausted cry. "Sam, I can't do it." "Mr. President," the speaker replied with solemnity, "you've got to do it." Perhaps the most convincing proof of the unparalleled personal respect in which Sam Rayburn was held by his colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike, occurred during World War II. With the highly secret scientific discovery of nuclear energy by American scientists, it became imperative to appropriate money in sufficient quantity to develop the actual weapons swiftly. But this required public passage of legislation by Congress, and any appropriation of a sufficient sum to carry out the totally secret program could only take place in the altogether public arena, where elected practitioners of congressional debate pride themselves in exposing the intimate details of every new public program. The vexing question of how to get the money without exposing the vastly important secret weapon was brought personally to Speaker Rayburn by top defense officials. Rayburn faced the problem candidly in the only way he knew. He very frankly and openly, in the briefest possible terms, verbally assured the House that the nature of that appropriation could not be divulged, nor lengthily discussed without destroying its value, but he personally had looked into the matter, and that, in his honest belief, passage of the legislation could hasten the favorable end of the war. With no more comment from any source, the Speaker called for a vote, and the legislation passed unanimously. There is no parallel to this, I am assured, in the history of the Congress. From this, I think, may be concluded that of all our distinguished presiding officers, Sam Rayburn deserves recognition as the one who, in the face of dire necessity, could confidently call upon the unanimous personal trust and honor of the entire American Congress. There's one other aspect of Mr. Sam's unique leadership style that I must mention here. It is the Speaker's personal manner in asking for a vote from an individual member on a controversial topic. This personal episode, which impressed me lastingly, occurred in 1957 and involved the very first civil rights bill that had passed the United States Senate since Reconstruction days, almost a full century earlier. Previously to this occasion, some senator or group of senators always had filibustered on any bill to an untimely death if it appeared anywhere near likely to pass. On this rare occasion, thanks to the efforts of Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, the bill had passed the Senate. For once, the House vote would be determinate. The bill was under debate on the House floor when Speaker Rayburn sent a page to ask me to come to the front of the chamber and to visit with him briefly. "Jim," he said, "I think you want to vote for this bill. I know you are receiving a lot of angry letters threatening you with all manner of retribution if you do. But I believe you're a big enough man to overcome all of that. And I know you'll be proud in future years that you did." He was right on all counts. I did want to vote for the bill and did so. I was indeed receiving a load of angry hate mail with only faintly veiled threats. But somewhat surprisingly, I suffered no lasting political harm, and I am, as Rayburn prophesied, proud that I did. And as you most surely can discern, I'm happy that I lived and served in an era that let me have the friendship and example of Speaker Sam Rayburn. Thank you, Mr. Wright.